Tanche Kiamaten, good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone. I want to thank you all for the opportunity to be here. Thank you to my mentor, Paolo, and ICANN for the warm welcome. And I also want to give appreciation to my fellow peers here for their fascinating presentations. I come from the rural Indigenous community of Swan River, Manitoba, Canada. My presentation will be on digital sovereignty for Indigenous communities. Next slide, please. I want to start by acknowledging the stark realities many Indigenous communities face in terms of digital access. Limited broadband infrastructure in remote areas severely hampers their participation in the global digital economy. For instance, in Canada, specifically Saskatchewan, only 1.7% of on-reserve households have access to the CRTC's high-speed internet standard. And in Manitoba, it's just 2%. The digital divide is not just about access, though. It's about empowering Indigenous communities to fully engage in the global digital space and manage their digital identities. Now, the barriers are far-reaching and complex. First, there's a significant lack of reliable high-speed internet. Many remote and rural Indigenous communities struggle with the inadequate infrastructure. Added to this is the high cost of broadband services and digital literacy gaps, especially among older generations, specifically Indigenous elders. Lastly, geographical isolation further limits their connection to global digital platforms. These challenges not only hinder access, but also perpetuate digital exclusion. So what exactly is digital sovereignty? Digital sovereignty refers to the rights of Indigenous peoples to govern their digital identities, resources, and data. It's about maintaining control over how communities engage with the digital world and ensuring the protection of their cultural heritage online. This includes the management of their own digital identities, the protection of their data and resources, ensuring equitable access to the digital economy, and safeguarding their own cultural heritage and, more importantly, languages online. And now let's connect digital sovereignty with ICANN's work. ICANN plays a crucial role in global internet governance. I think we all know that. But by including Indigenous perspectives within the policy discussions, ICANN can advocate for equitable access to digital platforms, support Indigenous-led digital infrastructure projects, and ensure that cultural heritage, not just for Indigenous peoples, but for all peoples, are safeguarded online. ICANN's involvement ensures that Indigenous communities have a voice in policy decisions related to domain names, data management, and digital infrastructure. Now, internet governance affects every aspect of Indigenous communities' ability to participate within the global digital economy, to express our own cultural identities, and to access essential services and safeguard our own knowledge and resources. Now, policies that exclude Indigenous voices or limit access perpetuate this digital inequity and cultural erasure. For example, without the ability to manage digital identities, Indigenous peoples are unable to control how they are represented online, which we have seen has led to misrepresentation and which can lead to the erasure of their culture. Now, to increase Indigenous engagement within digital infrastructure and governance, we must take practical steps. First, we need to develop Indigenous-led digital infrastructure and community technology hubs. This will provide the foundation for meaningful participation in the digital economy. Second, collaborative platforms between Indigenous leaders and internet governance bodies should be established to ensure Indigenous voices are integrated into decision-making. Third, we must implement initiatives that protect Indigenous cultural heritage and data online. Finally, targeted capacity building programs to increase digital literacy are essential, especially for the younger and older generations who may lack the skills to navigate the digital world. Now, ICANN has a key role in enabling these changes. ICANN can provide funding for Indigenous-led digital infrastructure projects and support capacity building initiatives focused on digital literacy and internet governance. They can facilitate Indigenous representation in policymaking processes and collaborate with communities to develop platforms that promote cultural preservation. The at-large program, the Global Indigenous Ambassador Program, must be brought back. Most importantly, ICANN must ensure that Indigenous digital rights are prioritized in global internet governance discussions. In conclusion, inclusive internet governance that respects Indigenous digital sovereignty is essential for empowering communities, safeguarding cultural heritage, and ensuring equitable access to the global digital economy. By working together, Indigenous leaders, ICANN, and other stakeholders, we can create a digital future where Indigenous peoples have control over their data, identities, and participation in global spaces. Marcy, thank you for your time and attention, and I now welcome any questions and insights you may have.
Thank you, Justin. Very interesting presentation. Thanks. Questions in the audience? Okay, we'll start with Vinny, please.
Thank you, Justin, for the presentation. I wanted to ask, when you talk about digital identities, what do you really mean by digital identities? And my second question, I think ICANN is focused on one world, one internet. So I think the world's sovereignty kind of goes against that. And when we consider all the indigenous communities all over the world, so what is your perspective on allowing all those communities to be sovereign while maintaining that one internet idea? Thank you.
Of course, those are great questions. Pertaining to Indigenous peoples, within a policy sort of agenda, I think it's incredibly important to have a distinctions-based approach, because when we talk about Indigenous peoples, there's not an umbrella-based approach that should be implemented, not just within ICANN, but within federal governments, within states, because not all Indigenous communities are the same. Within Canada, there's the First Nation, the Métis and Inuit. Within Norway, there's the Sami, and there's the Maori in New Zealand. There are distinct languages and distinct cultures that, might not intersect. I think within digital sovereignty, it's important to articulate those differences to enhance those bridges that exist. And when we talk about one world, one internet, I think, it's about engaging and highlighting the different communities, because we're not one entire mass of we don't all have the same thoughts, the same feelings, and everything like that. Within one internet, I think the beauty of that is the differences, is the cultures within that. When we talk about digital sovereignty, we all want to provide ourselves on the internet in a genuine way, and in a way that respects our culture, not just as Indigenous peoples, but in any culture, in any language, to have the tools and the operations and the spaces to do that in a respectful manner that is distinctions based, that'll help provide more access and, a truer feeling to the notion of one world, one internet.
Thanks, Justin. I'll go to Glenn next, please.
Yeah, it's not really a question. I'm just sharing some knowledge with you. For declaration, I am not an employee for ICANN, but ICANN has done a number of things to support the North American Indigenous community. One, we promoted the idea, and very receptively, Serenosh and Gang with Fellowship, they have singled out Indigenous participants from North America. So we've had a number of people from Canada and the United States who have actually attended ICANN meetings. So there's an example, one example that they did. In addition to that, they've sponsored Louis Ugal with the IDN committee. He's working very hard on the with the diacritics with Nunatug the language of Northern Quebec and elsewhere, and it's going through the process of having it as an IDN. So there's two examples of where they put their money where their mouth is. And I'm not an employee, right, Saranish? But I just want to let you know. On digital sovereignty, I had an impression you were going a different direction. And I think there's a kernel there, and I got lost in a lot of other stuff. But that's a super project in itself. But I would suggest there's a professor at U of T. He's retired now. But if you just do digital sovereignty and U of T, you'll find his name. Some very, very good stuff on that. And I think you're right. I think you're touching on a big issue for the First Nations. A whole bunch of other, I'll talk to you privately. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Shreya, go ahead, please.
Justin, thank you for a wonderful presentation on this really important yet often overlooked topic in the digital space. I'm familiar with the history of Indigenous peoples in the U.S., and I was wondering, there's been a huge history of distrust among government bodies and Indigenous peoples, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how we can overcome this distrust, especially in engaging Indigenous peoples in the digital environment, and if young people could have any role in that.
Of course, thank you very much for the inquiry. I mean, yes, it's a common narrative, I think, within not just organizations, but within governments, within states, that engaging with Indigenous peoples, especially considering the past, and especially the present too, there's distrust, there is an uneasy feeling to authentically engage. And I think within ICANN, within different organizations, the best way to do that is to not provide a sort of colonized outsider approach, but to actively engage within the community, to seek representation from the community. If you have a board, if you have a youth advisory, to actively search for Indigenous representation, to actively search within communities and work within the governance structures of those communities. So in part, it's an education to understand how these distinct communities work, but it's also taking the time to use that distinctions-based approach to actively engage with them. And for youth, I think youth have the tools within their hands to engage and search for information that has never been there before, and for youth to engage with Indigenous cultures, it's something that is critical within our time, because a lot of Indigenous languages and cultures are being lost with the deaths of Indigenous elders. Digital sovereignty and the digital space can be in part a solution to safeguarding and keeping those languages and cultures alive. Youth can utilize social media, they can utilize their own networks to actively engage, but in part it has to be of the organizations and the youth to themselves engage with the communities, because many of them are rural and isolated or in northern territories. So yes, it's definitely a learning process, but a process that should be utilized nonetheless. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on to some online. There's an online question and a hand raised.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation, Justin. Just a couple of quick comments. You might want to look more broadly about the international discourse on digital sovereignty or cyber sovereignty, because it really has been used as a tool by some governments to repress access to information and the voice of Indigenous and ethnic minority communities around the world. So that's something I just put out as a caution if you're going to be using the term digital sovereignty. And then with respect to some of the other conversations and discussions you're having in response to some of the other presenters, is I would highly encourage you to look to other regions, including Africa, as well as Taiwan, which have had a lot of discussion on how to integrate different approaches to digital governance and internet governance from the perspective of Indigenous communities and Indigenous learning. So looking beyond North America to other regions in the world where these conversations are very robust. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'll definitely check that out.
Okay, any other questions for Justin in the room? Alfredo, go ahead, please.
I thought Glenn was going to mention this as well. Within ICANN, we're working on universal acceptance. Actually, we have a lot of activities going on between the end of this month and April, where we're talking precisely, in some cases, about the indigenous communities within the United States. In my case, since I belong to at large the Navarro region, and we have an event where we're going to talk about precisely that issue between Canada, United States, continental United States, because of its English, and in Puerto Rico in Spanish. Now, my question goes back to how the indigenous communities and the concept you have of digital sovereignty. You have to keep in mind that the biggest concern is the domain names, because they have some special characters that need to be implemented, and that's a technical issue. And Bill Juris, which is here, is an expert in that. He's actually working with within the working group. He's a member dealing with that specifically, so he can talk to you, I guess, in private about that and clarify a few things that I think you need to understand better. Now, going back to my question, I have the feeling that your presentation deals more with content than with how can we get them to communicate and establish the infrastructure that they need to maintain their cultural life. So, and this goes back to what Elizabeth also mentioned, that you have to look outside of the United States and Canada and see what's happening in other countries. Now, my question, having said all that, is how do you think ICANN can, besides providing the infrastructure, help these communities deal with the technical aspect of being able to communicate through the internet, because there's a language barrier in terms of the dialects and so forth?
Of course, yeah. And certainly the domain name structure is one in which it's appreciated, especially within the Inuktitut language. We've seen within the North, especially in Canada, that there's active work within the federal government to better connect with northern Indigenous communities. But in terms of how these Indigenous communities outside of North America and even outside of South America, there are a lot of times where, especially within Australia, New Zealand, Norway, Africa, even Thailand, there are areas within NGOs and international conferences where these voices are lost, and that's disconcerting, because I think there are great things happening there. When you're engaging with Indigenous communities, the best representations and the representatives within those communities can be brought about through civil society organizations and nonprofit organizations, because these organizations, a lot of the times, have Indigenous connections and Indigenous leadership structures that actively reach out. I myself have a nonprofit within Canada with various networks around the world to Indigenous nonprofits and civil society organizations. So I think having that opportunity through NextGen, I'm here through NextGen, and this is an opportunity where I can learn, where I can share this perspective, and wherein tomorrow we can better connect and better come to solutions that can bring about a more constructive dialogue and bring about opportunities that can engage Indigenous peoples outside of North America. So hopefully that answered it. But if anything after the presentation, I'd be happy to talk.